Was Anand's presentation just the most phenomenal thing? I mean, just the most phenomenal thing. As I say, tough act to follow, but we're going to do that. And we're going to do that now in a powerful way. And we want to engage your voices. We call this a town hall meeting. We've not done this before. And through a lot of this, I'm going to come over here. Let's see, where is it? I'm going to get this thing called a microphone. I'm going to come down the steps. I'm going to come out into the audience, and I'm going to talk to anybody who's interested in talking. And you're going to pose questions to and make observations for our panel to respond to when we bring them up here. But I want to start by introducing to you Bob Perciasepe here. Bob Perciasepe heads a thing that we fondly called C2ES, which stands for?
The Center for Climate and Energy Solutions.
Solutions. Okay. But I want you to know a little bit about Bob, and as I'm going to want you to know about our panelists who join us, because this is really an extraordinary, exceptional, and unbelievably unique opportunity for you and for us to engage with people who've had an incredible career and perspective and influence on the world. Bob is, as I said, president for the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. He's widely recognized in the United States and around the world for his expertise. C2ES is for its role as a leading and independent voice for practical policy and ideas and solutions to address energy and climate challenges. He's been an environmental policy leader for inside and outside government for
don't use the number of years.
A few years. And his most influential, well, I don't know if it was your most influential role, but certainly the one we talk about is deputy administrator of a thing called the Environmental Protection Agency. Anybody heard of that? He might have an idea or two about what's going on over there these days. Let me pull my list here because I've got a little bit more. He was also, before he was over at EPA, he was the CEO for the National Audubon Society. All heard of the National Audubon Society? If you haven't, check it out. He served in the Clinton administration as the EPA's Assistant Administrator for Clean Water and as the Assistant Administrator for Clean Air. So his areas of expertise are demonstrable and specific and deep. And before his federal service in government, he served as Maryland's Secretary of the Environment. And for anybody who knows Maryland, Maryland has, among other things, something that sets it apart from many other places, or at least it shares a piece of something that sets it apart, called the Chesapeake Bay, which is an astonishing wetland and area. And I actually have the privilege every year of hosting a show on Maryland Public Television on the Chesapeake Bay, because the Chesapeake Bay is in a very ambitious cleanup phase, and so we track that, and Maryland Public Television is committed to tracking that. But what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about and really address the question, do we have the energy to lead? And you can take that in a lot of different ways, but let me turn it over to Bob to make some opening comments.
Thanks, Frank. So today's discussion and town hall meeting, we're really going to try to focus on that issue of leadership. And I think it's pretty clear that right now there may not be leadership on energy and the environment in a broad sense at the federal level. And I think what we saw, for instance, when the president decided that they would start a process to pull out of the Paris Agreement, we saw sort of what I call spontaneous combustion of cities and states and businesses, major businesses in the world and in the United States saying, well, you know, we think we still need to keep working on this. This is pretty important. We have an international span of influence, and we want to not lose that in terms of both political leadership in the world, but also in technology leadership in the world and the exportation and development of those technologies. So we see some interesting things happening because of that spontaneous combustion. Well, first of all, thousands of entities, from small little bakeries in Vermont all the way to large multinational corporations like Apple, have signed on to a statement saying they're going to keep working toward those Paris Agreement types of energy solutions. So when you step back and say, well, what is that resulting in? Well, right now, over 60% of the cities in the United States have some kind of electric vehicle purchase program. Or almost 70% of them have looked at how they can get renewable energy into some of their buildings and energy efficiency. We find a situation where 17 states, and these are bipartisan states, who have said, we're going to keep trying to do policies in our state that can help further the United States' role in these international energy and climate agreements. We have over 60% of the Fortune 500 companies in the United States have set some kind of greenhouse gas goal. And 160 of the 160 largest manufacturers in the United States, over 60% of those have set greenhouse gas reduction goals. So you see that in addition to just saying we're going to still work on it, we actually have real action happening at that state, local, and business leadership level. It isn't saying it's all synchronized. It isn't saying that it's all going in perfectly the right direction, but it's certainly doing something. And I think that's what we're going to explore today. Where is the leadership going and how do we get there? And I think it's important, there's an important undertow to this, that ultimately we can't do this without a partnership between the federal government and these other entities. Every major move forward that the United States has ever made, almost in its entire history, has been an interesting confluence of business and market and consumer and government policy interests, whether it's electrifying the country in the 1930s, whether it's the telephone, whether it's the internet, whether it's gas development, whether it's interstate highways, whether it's the space program. All of these major leaps forward that we have made as a country have always been a confluence of the federal, state, local, and business leadership. So how will we recapture that? How do we proceed while that may be fractured? I think is going to be an important part of what we talk about today. And I think one of the other important things is we often hear this thing about, we don't want to pick winners and losers, and how do we get there from here? I think it might have been something on one of your questions before, which we're going to talk about in a second. I always like to see, well, we may not want to pick winners and losers, but we certainly want to pick the future. And so let's see what our panel can help us on that. But let's see what your survey questions said. So Frank, come on up and let's talk about those.
So let's take a look at some of your questions. Everybody get a chance to answer, I hope? Let's see how you did. The first question is, as technology, let's see, where is our first question there? As technology improves to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, will communities of all races, ethnicities, and economic status benefit? Yes, 32%, no, 45%, not sure, about a quarter of you. Next question. Next question is, has the scientific community provided ample evidence that humans contribute to climate change? Yes, 47%. Yes, but we need to learn how to better reduce or respond to its impacts, 51%. Next question. Choose the statement that best represents your view. Federal policies, you're just talking about some of them, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions should incentivize technologies to promote U.S. leadership in green manufacturing, 93%. No, not prioritize some over the other, just 5%. Next question, that's okay, it's all right. Next one. Which low carbon options are most promising? Nuclear, carbon, biofuels, all of the above, okay? 34% all of you above, but go back, please. But I'm interested in the carbon capture, use, and storage, 19% of you. That's 20%, that's a fifth of the room. That's very interesting. Next one. Who's leading the way on climate change today? The U.S. government and agencies, 1%. Wow, that's an underwhelming vote of approval. Of course, there may be a little demographic thing going on in the audience here, but U.S. business communities, cities, states, universities, 26%. Europe, 43%. We'll have to talk about that, Susan. What do you think? And then China, 3%, the global community, 28%. Bob, what's your take on this? The 1% thing is really pretty amazing.
Yeah, well, the federal government has right now been pretty out there trying to not do something about climate change, and they're not shy about that, so I don't think that's an interpretive answer. People aren't trying to read tea leaves there. I think that's basically what they're working on. And so I think that probably is representing what is happening, unfortunately.
What's your thought on the technology question, the direction, and how people feel about that?
I noticed when we did it that renewable energy was not one of the all of the above, but I was happy to see all of the above, because the truth is, we can't put all our eggs in one basket. We have to have a mix.
That's the John McCain strategy, right? The all of the above, you need it all.
Yes, and so that translates very nicely into solutions for climate change and reducing, mitigating greenhouse gases.
Great. Well,
there was one other thing that I think is worth pointing out. I think there were quite a few respondents that were worried about how equitable these issues are, and I think that may be...
And what's your thought on that?
Well, I think that the most vulnerable are most affected by the impacts of climate change, and then on the other hand, there's often a worry that the solutions will cost them a disproportionate amount. So it's a very important policy issue that underpins how we solve these problems.
All right. Well, we'll be talking about all of that, Bob, and I'm going to be back to you down below. So let me invite the panel up. Come, please take your seats, and then I'm going to introduce them to you, and our conversation will begin. Please welcome our panel, everybody. And as I say, we have an astonishing panel here, but you're going to be driving much of this conversation. We'll start up here to begin with. Let me start by introducing each of our guests. Denise Fairchild, wave Denise, is the president. Denise is the president of something called the Emerald Cities Collaborative. The Emerald Cities Collaborative is a national nonprofit organization. You're based here in Washington, right?
Yes, we are.
Based in Washington. You have affiliates in other cities around the country?
6 cities.
How many cities?
6.
6 cities. And your mission is?
To create a sustainable, just, and inclusive economy.
A sustainable, just, and inclusive economy. To build cities that are resilient,
green our cities, build our communities, and to make sure as we build this new green economy that we involve low-income and communities of color as a part of the beneficiaries and planners and drivers of this new economy.
So Denise has about a 40-year track record in sustainable and community economic development. In 1995, you founded and directed the Community and Economic Development Department at Los Angeles Trade Technical College. And an affiliated nonprofit community development research technical assistance at CDT. So a lot of experience in this range. Nick Akins is next. Say hi to Nick, everybody. So I like to say we have a Roosevelt, an Eisenhower, and 2 presidents here. So Nick is president and CEO of American Electric Power. What's American Electric Power?
It's one of the largest electric utilities in the country, and obviously focused on all the above strategy.
Nick is on the board of directors at the Electric Power Research Institute, the Edison Electric Institute. He's a member of the executive committee of the Business Roundtable. And you're also a member of the board of directors of the nuclear, as I mentioned, the Nuclear Energy Institute. So what do you do on those boards? What do you advocate for? What expertise are you bringing?
So many of these boards are focused on different areas around the energy spectrum, and we're obviously focused on making sure that we are able to make that transition in a very positive way and really describe what our industry is about, not only from nuclear perspective, but also from an electric utility perspective, to think about some of the issues that really society works with us, and we're really responsive to what society wants. And that's really an engaging part of the discussion we have.
Okay, well, we'll be getting into a lot of that. Susan Eisenhower. Susan is CEO and chairman of the Eisenhower Group. And among many things, Susan is a distinguished policy analyst, consultant, advisor to Fortune 500 companies. You've served on several blue ribbon commissions dealing with energy, including?
The nuclear energy. I was co-chairman of NEAC, which is the Secretary of Energy's Nuclear Energy Advisory Council.
And nuclear energy and you, where does that come from?
Well, I spent most of my career in the national security field, and I made a segue out of studying nuclear weapons policy into nuclear energy, and suddenly you're in the middle of the electricity sector.
She's also an author. How many books have you written?
6.
And she was my inspiration when I was writing, but when I was thinking of writing a book, we went to lunch and she said, "You can do this, Frank." So,
Telling Frank
thank you.
so.
She's also responsible for this event, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. Finally, we're joined by Theodore Roosevelt IV. Please give. Can I call you Ted?
Absolutely.
Can they call you Ted?
Yes, if you call me Mr. Roosevelt, I'm going to look over my shoulder for him.
Ted is the managing director in investment banking at Barclays, based in New York. So you're an investment banker.
I am.
So
We have, as investment bankers, we have less popularity even than the members of Congress.
we're going to have a grand old time here, aren't we? And you are you serve as chairman of the firm's Clean Tech Initiative.
I do.
So what does that mean?
What it means is that Barclays has faith that there are going to be terrific technologies that are going to emerge that are going to help us address questions around water, around climate change, around food. And we're not smart enough to identify them in advance. We need to go out into the field, talk to the people, and then figure out how we as a financial institution can help them. It's hard, because sometimes they aren't run as well as they should be. They need access to money, but they're not credit worthy. So we then have to find strategic investors for them. It's an immensely rewarding activity, because it takes you all over the place and all over the world.
And you are, I should say, you are chair of the board of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, Bob Perciasepi's group, C2ES,
Yes.
which is the group we're.
So I take my instructions from Bob.
I see, I see. Okay, Trivial Pursuit question here. Ted's great-grandfather would be whom? Who? Franklin, she's wrong.
Oh, boy.
Any other? Ted's great-grandfather would be whom? Teddy Rose? How'd she do?
She got it.
Okay. Susan Eisenhower's grandfather would be whom?
Ike.
How'd
Ike.
they do?
Fair.
Okay, we're good here. So let's begin in this conversation. And as I say, we'll open it up. I'm going to come down here, but I'd like to establish a couple things with the group first. Bob talked about the role of the federal government. We saw the votes of 1% of those who are leading the way, think the federal government is leading the way in climate change. So this is what I'd like to ask for you both all to kick around very quickly. Given the federal government's role that we're seeing now, does climate/energy leadership now devolve to traditional energy companies, big oil, big utilities, which will be responsible first to their bottom lines and not so much to climate and society and community? And Nick, I'm going to put you on the spot on that, and I'm going to start by asking you that. I mean, you don't have the federal government breathing down your neck the way you did. This government, the Trump administration's nearly first action was to come and say, we're going to rip up the Clean Power Plan. We're going to walk away from Paris climate agreements. We want our energy sector to thrive and do well, and we're going to lift the shackles so that we can drill more and extract our fuels.
I think it's interesting, the responses, I think it was 27% said business would take a leading role from that perspective. There's clearly a change that's occurring because of technology, certainly because of crowdsourcing of policy-related initiatives. Certainly from our perspective, and any company that's doing business today has to look and be responsive to the stakeholders of the company. And that's not just the federal government.
So when you say the stakeholders, who are you talking about?
I'm talking about our shareholders who are around the world and have certain expectations around movement toward a cleaner energy economy, and our customers. Our customers are very focused on ensuring that we make that process of moving forward to transition resources and be able to find resources that are benign for the
But
environment.
aren't your shareholders mostly interested in the bottom line and profit?
It's really interesting because shareholders, yes, you could say they're predominantly interested in profits, dividends. In our business, we've been around 112 years. All those have been quarter after quarter of providing dividends to our shareholders. Obviously, they're interested in that, but they're also interested in how you accomplish that. And we've had a lot of emphasis placed on sustainability, on corporate accountability associated with the progress that we're making. We have to be responsive to the social issues that we're involved with because we're so it really included in the communities that we serve.
So let's just make sure let's bring people up to speed on what AEP is.
Yep.
You're a utility.
Right.
Where are you based?
We're based in Columbus, Ohio.
So where's your service
We have
area?
predominant businesses in 11 of the U.S. states. We're actually in 32 states with solar and wind and other types of applications. But predominantly, we serve those 11 states from a retail perspective.
And a utility, you generate power?
We generate power.
And
we
you
have
distribute it through the
generation, distribution, transmission, and of course, now movement to new technologies.
Okay. How much coal are you burning?
We burn about 40 million tons of coal a year.
What percentage of the power you generate does that?
In 2007, that was 83 million tons of coal.
So 2007 was how much?
83 million.
And now?
Now it's around 45 million.
So you've cut it about in half?
Yep, right.
What percentage of the power you generate does coal now represent?
Coal represents about around 48%.
So still quite a lot.
Yep.
Why the decline in coal? Is that because the government told you to get out of it?
No, actually, partially because the government did have certainly focused in the last administration on moving toward a cleaner energy economy. That was included. But secondly, because we've had the advent of new technologies. I mean, renewables have come into play. Shale gas has come into play. Technologies around energy efficiency and smart grid type applications have come into play. So any smart investor is going to look at our company and say, you need to be diversifying your resources and mitigating risk.
The president and the administration say we want to bring back coal. Are you reinvesting in coal?
No, we're not.
Why?
Primarily because we do want to diversify our risk. Our shareholders are expecting us to do that. And for us to stay around for the next 100 years, we want to make absolutely sure that we're moving toward that cleaner energy economy that our customers expect.
Are you continuing to decrease your coal usage?
Yes, we are.
And what are you replacing that with?
If you look at our resource plans for the next 10 years, it is around renewables, solar, wind, energy efficiency related technologies, and backup of some natural gas. And then, of course, technologies around energy storage and those types of applications are also coming into play.
And
there is no other.
When you talk about wind and solar, what exactly are you investing in? Are you actually investing in the solar panels that go on my neighbor's roof and on my roof, or are you investing in big solar farms and wind farms?
And centralized solar, because it's controllable. It's half the cost of rooftop solar, much more efficient. And certainly from that perspective, getting the same environmental benefits.
And what about wind?
Wind power, we're investing in heavily. Matter of fact, right now we have the largest wind power project in the country that's proposed, 2,000 megawatt facility in Oklahoma.
In Oklahoma. So one of the things I want to suggest to all of you, and this is what any journalist does and what any person does, is I'm hearing all of this, I'm storing this in my brain, so should you be. Where are the stories? What would you pursue? How would you tell this? Because we're going to come back to that. Susan Eisenhower, I want to come to you next. Big focus on national security, on looking at the world, big focus on nuclear. When we asked that question about nuclear, that did not pop off the chart. It was there, but it didn't. Have we got this wrong?
Well, first of all, I think it's a mistake to be retiring perfectly good nuclear power plants for reasons of economy alone. Every country that I traveled to in the course of my career had a government that viewed nuclear power and everything that implies as a strategic asset of the country. I think that nuclear is even more important today for what it contributes to producing clean energy.
In 1954, your grandfather signed something called the Atomic Energy Act. And when your grandfather signed the Atomic Energy Act, here's what he said. As I sign this bill, I'm confident it will advance both public and private development of atomic energy, that it will thus lead to greater national strength, and that programs undertaken as a result of this new law will help us progress more rapidly to the time when this new source of energy will be wholly devoted to the constructive purposes of man. Why are we not building more nuclear power plants if your grandfather had this big vision in 1954?
Well, first of all, 1954 was a long time ago. But the vision, I think, lives on. And I think that there are some very exciting new technologies that are underway, small modular reactors. This is taking a huge plant that costs, Nick can could speak to this very well. The capital cost of building large 1,000-megawatt plants or 1,500-megawatt plants is just too big for the size of industries and utilities. So these smaller modular reactors have tremendous flexibility, capability to be co-located with all sorts of other forms of electricity, and many of the designs underway right now are proliferation mitigating and meaning that the waste problem, as we see it, is addressed fully and also are much safer.
So we're talking about leadership, right? Where's the leadership coming from?
Where is
the
the leadership
coming
on
from
that
with
one?
nukes? Because environmental regs, it's like 15 years if you're going to get through all of that to build a nuke, and they're tremendously expensive. And renewables and shale gas, natural gas, make life a lot cheaper and easier, right? So,
Well, Frank, I can tell you, I was on NEAC, and part of NEAC's responsibilities were to choose which small modular reactors were going to be receiving funding. This is crazy. Back during the Eisenhower administration, he founded DARPA, which was designed to really put the pedal to the metal to bring about all kinds of innovative technologies. Why we're not doing that in the nuclear area, given the climate change issue, which I think is central to our long-term national security, is something I don't understand.
Ted Roosevelt, investment banking. I'm not sure we think of investment banking as leading the way, except on Wall Street. Are investment bankers leading the way in where they're putting their money and placing their bets?
Yeah, I think definitely. I'll give you a couple of examples, one of which was yesterday we announced in the UK, we are going to be rolling out green mortgages. And we're doing that because it's economically advantageous for us, because we've determined after a little bit of studying that people who invest in green houses that are sustainable are better credits for us.
What is a green mortgage exactly?
Okay, a green mortgage means we will give them a mortgage at a lower interest rate than would be otherwise the case because their house is green and sustainable.
And how do you define a green and sustainable house?
It's energy efficient. It uses less energy than a conventional house, and it's been designed from scratch to be as energy efficient. It's like LED.
So does it have to be a new house to get a green mortgage?
No, it can be retrofitted, but generally they're going to be new houses because retrofitting tends to be expensive.
And it's going to be a cheaper mortgage than you'd get otherwise on the market?
Correct.
This is in the UK?
In the UK.
How about the US?
In the US, what we're doing is, you've heard probably of the PACE programs, which is where if somebody wants to put a solar panel or some kind of energy efficiency device in their house, they will get a mortgage from the state of California where this occurs. But there were difficulties in getting this rolled out on scale. So what we and other banks have done, we said, okay, we're going to take all of those mortgages and we're going to put them in a warehouse, and then we're going to sell bonds against those mortgages because they're going to be paid off, and the bonds will know that they're going to get paid off. Initially, there were difficulties because, I hate to say this, the large credit and banks like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae said, oh, no, you can't do that because that mortgage will be senior to ours. They weren't thinking clearly. We finally got them to the point where they thought more clearly.
So, Ted, at the risk of giving Nick Akins total heartburn here as I say this, why don't we have green mortgages in America that so incentivize new construction that every house that's built is built with solar panels?
Well, we want to move in that direction, I think is clear. But the first thing to do, let's make sure that the house is energy efficient, and it requires less heat to keep it at a given temperature, less energy. That's what you want to start off and do. Now, putting a rooftop solar on is something that you can do. Probably, as Nick has pointed out, it's not quite as economic as having the large, but I have a solar panel on our house in Martha's Vineyard, and my wife comes in periodically and say, you know how much our electric bill in Martha's Vineyard was last month? And I don't know because she pays the bill. It was $3. Because it works perfectly. We have a net metering system in Massachusetts, so when we generate electricity, it's sold back into the grid.
I just want to commend Mrs. Roosevelt on Martha's Vineyard for celebrating a $3.
But let me just follow up if I can, because Susan said a lot of stuff that was important. I don't want it to get lost. Generally, and Nick, correct me, generally the nuclear reactors that we are building today in this country are light water reactors. That, frankly, is an obsolete technology. We need to have more research and development in what I'd call fourth generation nuclear reactors. What is fourth generation? They're things like molten lead or molten salt. And they have a number of advantages. We haven't quite built them yet. But if you have a Fukushima event, they lose electricity, fine, let them sit down.
Fukushima was the meltdown. You all know about Fukushima, right? Yeah?
They'll cool down so you don't have a China syndrome problem. It won't melt and create problems. This is new technology that we should be leading the world on. Unfortunately, we're not. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission today doesn't have the capacity to lead the initiative on this. And I've got people who know much more about this than I do. I'm just outspoken. Where do we see this taking place? In Canada. Barclays is calling on both a company that's trying to develop fusion energy, and they want to raise $350 million for a semi-works plant. That's going to be hard. We're trying to figure out how can we get that done. We're thinking about it. That's what makes the job so interesting. And also a molten salt reactor, another company. Why is it in Canada? Because the Canadian regulations are more thoughtful and are looking towards the long term, where we are thinking, oh, this is what we do, and we can't get out of our little silo.
And how helpful would it be if we had more nuclear power with respect to climate change?
Dramatic difference.
Dramatic difference.
Nuclear is emission-free.
Okay, okay. Anybody from a campus where there's been a sort of divestiture, fossil fuel movement kind of thing? So lots. What's the investment bank community doing about that? You divesting of fossil fuels?
You know, it's relatively straightforward. If you look at what has happened to the price of wind and solar over the past 15 years, none of us 10 years ago would have thought that the price would have continued to drop as much as it has. Today we are seeing solar in some countries now is coming out 3 cents a kilowatt. This is extraordinary.
How does that compare to what we pay for natural gas?
It's probably slightly under natural gas right now.
It's about the same.
So renewables are now cheaper than natural gas?
In certain places, not everywhere, but yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Denise Fairchild, let me move to you. You are outspoken and eloquent, in fact, in your focus on community, not big corporate America, not big utilities. What's your perspective on where the leadership needs to come from, if not the top down?
It's not where it should come from, it's where it is coming from. It's coming from the community. And there is a book out there called Energy Democracy that really speaks to, it's storytelling, the narratives of community groups that are taking their energy future into their own hands.
Like, for example?
And there are stories from rural Mississippi to monolingual Laotian and Chinese immigrants in Oakland to suburban moms and kids in this DMV area that's actually growing a movement. And that movement is really, you can hear some of this around because of the Sierra Club, 100% renewable. Not all the above, 100% renewable. Keep it in the ground, the divestment movement. So this is a movement that is really in a network of community groups. We have Black Mesa, a First Nation that shut down the last coal plant that was feeding California electricity and using that stranded asset, for example, for really utility scale solar.
Do these communities
Appalachian communities that, you know, they're looking at Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, that are moving Kentuckians out of coal mines. And we have this
Kentuckians moving Kentucky out of coal mines?
Out of coal mines, the workers out of coal mines, with this notion, a community notion that we have called just transition, which is how do we not only strand, what we do with stranded assets, but what we do with people who are losing jobs. And coal has been losing jobs for at least a decade, 500,000 jobs. So how do we move them from the coal mine into the clean energy? So this is a movement that's happening in every corner of America and is driven by people that are concerned about public health, because in the Laotian community, they look at Chevron right across the street from where they live, and all the smoke that's taking their kids to the hospitals for asthma again and again, to the rural Mississippi folks who are paying 40% of their household budget for utilities, yet they are owners of the energy company.
Wait.
You're
40% of their
40%.
household budgets are going to what?
Utility, electricity, to pay turn on the lights. And these are rural co-ops. The electrification that your cousin, I guess it's your Teddy's cousin, electrified the rural communities because the market wouldn't go into
FDR,
these areas.
Franklin Roosevelt, right?
Right.
Rural Electrification Act.
REAs, and there's a wonderful story about that, because the utilities didn't want to put them into rural America, which at that time was where most of America lived, or probably 50%.
Right.
And where the poverty,
And-
so much
And it's where
poverty.
the poverty was.
Right.
So we created, and actually it was an investment bank that actually came out with a mechanism of financing it. So occasionally investment banks do something that's good.
But the problem today is, and the movement that's happening now, is that one organization in this book that tells these stories started knocking on the door of the residents in these communities and said, do you know you own an energy company? And folks are unclear. They've never received a dividend, much less paying high utility bills, still burning coal, all right, which is then impacting their public health, not on the governance structure, not sitting on the board of these co-ops.
That's a huge issue.
It's a huge issue. So there's a whole movement around the country to really reclaim these rural co-ops, to be truly community-owned, and making sure that the dividends and the revenues from this go back into the communities to address broader community issues. So these are the kinds of exciting stories and efforts and struggles that are taking place across the country.
Denise, I want to. One of the fun parts about being a journalist, and one of the cool parts of stories, is you always look for, right, overcoming obstacles. You also look for a little conflict. You look for a little tension. Let me read from Denise's book. You wrote, "A global energy war is underway. It is being waged on numerous fronts with distinct battle lines. It's man versus nature, global north versus global south, fossil fuel versus clean energy, globalization versus local sovereignty, the powerful moneyed class versus low-income and indigenous communities and communities of color, the haves versus the have-nots, and fundamentally an extractive economy versus a regenerative economy." Denise, a war?
I think, well, as another analogy I want to put out there. These are vested interests. They're banking interests, utility interests. We are vested as we're slaves to the fossil fuel economy. I mean, we drive our cars, we plug in our iPhones, and so
You do that too.
we all are, all right? So we're junkies to the fossil fuel economy. And so what it's going to take to actually realign ourselves to the environment, to recognize that we are part of an ecosystem, and if we destroy that, we're destroying our survivability, means that it's a struggle over ideas, it's a struggle over values, it's a struggle over how we actually live our lives day to day and what we want for our future. So it's not going to be an easy answer to think about some of the stories in the book about some of the indigenous values of recognizing natural resources as part of the commons and how we begin to share our natural resources in a different kind of way as opposed to an extractive way. So these are not easy answers. And I have to give you the analogy of the slave economy. We had 400 years of the slave economy. People couldn't even imagine living lives without that economy. And it was global in the same way that fossil fuel economies. But it was a struggle. And it took the educational system and the religious community, it took the business community, it took black, white, all kinds of folks to come together and say, is this morally right? And is there a better way to live? And of course, it led to a civil war. Now, I'm not saying we go in there, but.
I hope not, but I would turn to Nick.
Great.
And she's a stakeholder.
I think what I find is interesting, because I totally agree with what Denise has said. But look at where we've gotten to having renewable energy so it is clearly competitive. It doesn't need subsidies anymore. That's an extraordinary development. Why did that happen? It happened basically because of government policy at the state level who told the utilities, We want to see in so many years, 20% of your electric generation is provided by renewables.
What percentage of renewables are you guys doing now?
We're around 11 to 12%.
And where do you have to be by 2025?
Oh, well, it varies by state
By state.
jurisdiction.
So, for example,
But generally, we still need to be around the 15%.
how much?
15.
15.
Let me put a little perspective on all this, okay? If you look at the supply during the cold weather, for example, less than 5% will be renewables. The rest is coal, natural gas, nuclear. Okay, so let's put that little bit of perspective in here. So
5%.
5%. So we're really working on the new technologies as they come to pass. So if you think about that as a platform, you really have to consider, okay, where do we go from here? And the new technologies are really what's being invested in today. So you're going to steadily see certainly the fossil side come down, and you're going to continue to see the increases in other forms of technologies, whether it's renewables, solar, wind, but also AEP is working very extensively on technology, the deployment of big data analytics, and the provision of what that means. If I can give an example real quick, it's about storytelling. And I grew up as an engineer working on the grid. The interconnected power system operations is my forte. Grew up with generation, transmission, distribution, central station generation, mainly fossil generation. So now, today, when you look at technologies, and we're looking at technologies that are pretty dramatic in terms of the aggregation. It's almost like crowdsourcing resources in many respects. So I'm in a Target store with one of the technologies we've been working with, watching customers. And one of the things we have is in the back of the store is the ability to lower the lighting. It's all LED lighting, so we lower the lighting by 50%. So someone's in front of the counter looking at whatever they're looking at, okay? And I'm thinking, okay, the lights are going to come down. They're going to wonder what's going on. They didn't raise their head, didn't bat an eye. They continued shopping. So what does that mean? It means a lot on several levels. Number one, what's the power? It's very powerful for us to be able to aggregate among all of these customers those types of activities, and it doesn't impact their ultimate customer at all. And then secondly, just the psychology of the customer themselves. There's only so many times a day you can do that, but with customers coming in and out, you can do it pretty much all day, get the inherent benefits of capacity, and not have to build that next central station generation facility. That's where we're moving to today.
Well,
Two quick points that I'm going to come out to the audience to bring you into the conversation.
Can I just
Yeah, sure, go
respond? I mean, one thing about Nick and the utility industry that I feel really good about is that the business model is changing. The sources of energy is absolutely changing because it's making economic sense now. And you've got assets that are retiring, expiring, so you might as well move into new technologies. It's amazing. The other part of it, though, is the kind of platforms, and is it centralized or distributed? Right? And that really gets to Susan's point about national security. The fact that we had an attack on our energy system, a week ago or 2 weeks ago, makes this notion of a decentralized energy system more important. And people are thinking about new models for utilities to be a service provider for the
You all
distributed
understand
energy.
the term distributed energy? Do you know what that is? Distributed energy is if I have panels on my roof and you do, and we've distributed as opposed to having a big central generating
or community
station.
grids, smaller
Right,
generations.
which
yeah.
creates great opportunities, but it also creates problems because we've invested billions and billions and billions into a central distribution system where so much capacity is. And if we start taking the customers away, so we have more Mrs. Roosevelt saying it only cost me $3, your business model starts to disintegrate, right?
Well, let's just think about many of these are still connected to the grid.
They're still connected to the grid, but if I don't need you anymore and I'm not buying from you anymore, you don't have my money.
But, okay, so we may get in a debate here, but you have public policy issues around things like net metering and those types of applications. There's an investment that's made on the grid itself, and that grid needs to be supported. Even when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing, supply has to come from somewhere. So we are still needed. Now the question becomes, what's the business model around that?
Right.
And also, how do we aggregate all that in a meaningful way for society?
Right. Two quick things. Nick, you told me when we were chatting earlier that your customers are demanding different things now. And this really struck me. And when we think about where is leadership coming from, what I heard in that is that leadership in this area is coming from your customer base. And we're not just talking about individual customers signing up. We're talking about big customers. Could you very briefly just share what's going on out there in that marketplace and where that leadership is coming from, what it means?
Oh, there's absolute expectation around moving to this clean energy economy. If we work with, and we do this with data farms, whether it's Facebook, Amazon, others, Walmart, they're really focused on being as benign as they can be from an environmental standpoint. That means they want their supply to reflect that as well.
So are you saying that they are literally pressuring you to produce
absolutely.
More renewables?
They will come in and from an economic development standpoint, and they'll have the requirement that we want our resources to come from renewables.
Okay, Susan, one for you, and then I'm coming down to you all. Anybody notice that Shell put out a little Dream-O-Vision plan just a few days ago called going to hit the 2-degree climate change target? And they had this big picture of what 2070 would look like, and it involved a lot less, if any, fossil fuels. Electric vehicles, batteries that become part of the general grid. Is big oil going to be a leader in this conversation in some strange way, or is this greenwashing, or what's going on with traditional power companies here, or energy companies?
Well, I don't know that I'm exactly the person on this panel to speak to that, but I think it's going to be perhaps in some circles a much slower process, especially where oil is concerned. You know, the vision is there, and we should be investing in the vision. But fossil fuels are, and especially oil, is very much part of the fabric of our society.
Does corporate America play a larger role now that the federal government is playing a lesser role in driving this conversation?
Well, I think it's very clear that the government is not driving this conversation at all. The fact that we still, the United States of America, up till now the global leader, has refused to recognize climate change is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, we've done it in previous administrations, but this is not progress going forward. And I think the great challenge for us is to actually align a future vision and demand actually that our politicians get with the program. We are feeling increasingly empowered. We've had a bunch of teenagers lead the way.
We've had a bunch of teenagers lead the way?
That's right. They had one of the biggest demonstrations down here on the Mall. And it's rather interesting that it took some high school students to show our generation that there's a future out there that is not being addressed. Now, whether you agree with what they were espousing or not is not really the issue. There's a sense of increasing empowerment in this country. And not a moment too soon, because anybody interested in the long-term vision has to be thinking about the enormous change that's coming about because of digitalization, because of international competition, because of changing business models, as Nick mentioned, because of new investment opportunities. But why on earth, I think the question I would like to finally pose to everybody is, why is America standing back from global leadership? We stand up and say, we're the global leaders, and then we don't demonstrate leadership. I don't understand that, and I hope you students will find some stories around that one, because it's a fascinating psychological situation.
Ted, just want to cite this, and then I'm grabbing the mic. Ted, you wrote in the Houston Chronicle a few months ago, quoting your great-grandfather, you said, in 1903 speech at the Grand Canyon, President Theodore Roosevelt urged local officials to protect this magnificent place from development. He said, leave it as it is. You cannot improve upon it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. What you can do is keep it for your children, your children's children, and all who come after you. Today, you wrote, the White House exhibits a vastly different approach toward our public lands. Energy extraction supersedes all other priorities. Who will take the leadership in protecting these lands from that extraction?
I'm looking at the leaders right here. We need you to get engaged, and there are three things that we need to do. One of which is we need to establish a dialogue of trust and respect with the Trump supporters. They are scared. They are very angry because they think they've been badly treated by the elite. And unfortunately, they're right. So we in the elite have to reach out to them and have a dialogue of trust, and we really need to talk to them, because if we don't do that, we're going to be at war with ourselves. And we are engaged, unfortunately, I agree with Denise. This nation is on the verge of a civil war.
Wait, what? Seriously? Are you
Yes.
saying-
Just look at what's
We're
happening
in this.
in terms of the political dialogue that exists in this country now. It doesn't exist. It's as bad as it was probably at about 1855, leading up to the Civil War. And I say that after thinking, giving a lot of thought about it. So we need to reestablish a dialogue with our fellow Americans, particularly those Americans that live in rural America, that have been disenfranchised, that didn't get the benefit. And if we don't do that, we're all at risk. This is a very serious political crisis. And that needs us to reach out. So Susan's comment about the high school kids, they saw something the rest of us didn't do. And they're providing leadership, and we need to join that train and get on it and help it go faster. Let me give you sort of an example that I find so morally offensive. Trump says, I'm going to bring back the coal mines. That's total bullshit.
Now tell us what you really think.
And it's false because it's not economic to do. The conversation we should be having with the coal miners, partly along with what Denise had, but should be even more direct, which is those families of the coal miners, they gave us their backs and their lungs so we could have energy when it was the only source of energy, and that allowed this country to grow, to become as prosperous as it has. What do we owe them? We owe them fully funded pension funds. We owe them health care plans.
That's right.
And the legacy liabilities are shed. This is wrong. And this is why I'm looking at you and saying, you need to come out with stories, and we need to reach out to those coal mining communities and saying, you are part of us and we want to help you. And the leadership that Denise is providing is just outstanding. Okay, I got excited enough for you.
Yeah, if I could say something. Hey, Frank, if I could say something very quickly.
Quickly, because I need to get down to the audience.
Okay.
I promise.
We're having fun with each other up here.
So we have a program now. I mentioned two things that I think really are interesting about social change. We have in our part of our territory, eastern Kentucky, southeastern Ohio, western West Virginia, which are hard hit from a coal mining perspective. We have an initiative now that we've been working with from an economic development standpoint with the governors and with others in the administration associated with this. It's really focused on making that transition from coal mining to, and actually we've done studies, you have 3 times the propensity and the skill level for machinery, which lends itself well to the aerodynamics and space industry. So we're really focused on changing the manufacturing base to aerospace and those types of activities and be able to provide useful employment for the people in that region. That's just an example of what could be done. The other is really around smart cities. You mentioned the local communities are taking on their own vision of the future. We're working extensively with Columbus, Ohio, which won the Smart Cities Challenge, and it's really around the adoption of electric vehicles to provide autonomous transportation charging stations, microgrids, renewables, adoption of the integration of those, but also reaching underdeveloped parts of the urban settings to ensure that there's transportation to healthcare, transportation to jobs, and that really will drive a new force in terms of the development from a socioeconomic standpoint. So those are the kinds of things that we're working on today. I think that will have a tremendous impact in the future.
I'm about to come down to the audience here, but I'm going to stand back here for a moment. I'm going to tell you why I said earlier that Susan was to blame for, or to get the credit for this event. Susan put a dinner together just before Donald Trump was sworn into office to contemplate the issue of what's going to happen to our energy and climate posture after the president who's promised to do all these things comes to office. And Nick was the leader, the conversation leader there. And I found myself, and I introduced myself to this nice man, and I realized I was sitting next to an Eisenhower and next to a Roosevelt, and listening to this incredible conversation that was in a small room, and I said to them, we need to bring this conversation out. More people need to hear this. There's too much, too important, too interesting, and that's why we're here. So Susan, thank you for that. So I'm going to come back. All right. Who wants to start? Anybody got a question or a comment to throw to the panel here? I've given you ample notice. We're going to start over here. Come on out to the audience, to the row. And I apologize to the cameras here that are streaming this, but tell us where you're from, what your name is, and go ahead.
I'm Andrew McGee, and I go to the George Washington University here. And
Glad I started with GW.
yes.
With all due apologies to everybody else. Go ahead.
So I have a question about more of the global political aspect of oil. If we have, if the United States starts to divest from things like fossil fuel, with Donald Trump lifting the ban on oil exports, do you think that it is a good thing for the United States now and in the future to be exporting our oil to countries that need it for national security, in the sense, especially in Europe, with Russia's hold over all those countries with their oil exports? Is it good, even if we're not using oil, for us to be exporting it to places that could use it to get away from those kinds of regimes?
Oil and natural gas, because we're now starting to export natural gas. Who wants to take that one?
I think what we are seeing is that our natural gas resources, nobody will want to make a prediction will last for 100 years. We don't know, but our ability to extract natural gas is getting better and better, and we're also finding new uses for natural gas, particularly in the Caribbean basin, where we can probably get some of those economies off burning diesel fuel, which is immensely harmful, and they have something cleaner. And I believe that the era of autonomous driving is going to be coming much sooner than most of us expect.
Even with the recent problems that we've had with fatalities and that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so that is going to, if we end up having more renewable and more nuclear energy that replaces burning of oil for transportation, which I think is likely, the value of oil will decrease over time. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia believes that, and he is moving as fast as he can to diversify the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia off oil because he thinks that its future is limited. That's an extraordinary thing of what he's trying to do.
Get to your question?
Yeah.
Well, and
Denise, you got something to add?
I
Go
just
ahead.
might add, the tension is that the competition for extraction and extreme extraction still exists. Climate change, if it's done nothing else, is actually opening up the Arctic for Russia and Norway, who are now really positioning themselves to extract more oil out of from the melting ice. So it's going to take a while, but I do believe that the technology is on our side to actually keep it in the ground.
All right, somebody else who's got another, let me come over here. Go ahead, I'll come back there. Tell us who you are, where you're from.
All right, my name's Ireland. I'm from West Virginia. I go to WVU there. And so you're talking about the coal companies, like especially in West Virginia, and moving away from coal. Well, that's a great idea. I completely agree with it. Our government in West Virginia has been proven to be the most corrupt because of the coal companies. So how do we deal with that? How do we change the government in West Virginia so that it's more willing to work with, like, moving forward with renewable resources?
Denise, you want to start with that?
Community organizing.
What?
Are you organizing?
Community organizing. Elect people that will vote the will of the community.
I think there's another thing that's going on here, though, and that is with the adoption of all these newer technologies, I think there is more of a rationalization now that we do need to move that future, even in West Virginia. The West Virginia leaders that I've talked to really understand. They understand the issue of it can't be entirely, their entire economy can't be built around coal. And certainly trying to make that transition, it's going to take time. And certainly it's going to take the outward forces coming in to say coal is not the complete answer. That there are other opportunities that are available. There's wind power, plenty of wind resources in West Virginia, certainly other types of resources. Even the movement to natural gas is helpful from a balancing perspective. But when you think about the transition that's occurring in the U.S., the advent of these technologies is going to be something that, again, from an economic development standpoint, is going to be an expectation. So every state's going to have to respond.
Ted, you got any thoughts on that one?
The corruption that you talk about, I'm afraid, is endemic. And I think that Denise has put her finger on it, and Nick is right also. And you're seeing leadership from some of the companies. We also need federal government leadership that's going to come in and say that's not acceptable and make it easier. And I'm curious, Nick, would you like to see a little more help from the federal government to help accelerate the transition so people will get jobs in the aerospace, et cetera? And I suspect the answer to that might be yes.
Absolutely.
And we're not saying that. So we're going to have to see more political action, both at the local level, and that's organizing, and shine sunlight on it. Sunshine is the best political disinfectant known to man. So bring more of that disinfectant there and make sure that all of this comes out so people get a sense of outrage and they will join you to get what needs to be done so it does get done.
Yeah.
Which is back to storytelling again, right? That's
Yes.
what journalism is supposed to do. That's
Right.
what community activism does. You effectively connect and communicate with your community.
And I think it was just West Virginia that just had the teacher strike. That one, the
West
teacher.
Virginia,
and
Oklahoma, and
yeah, that was out of organizing.
There really does seem to be this very strong grassroots movement, bottom-up sort of pushback on an array of issues now. So
that's
this
right.
may be a moment, yes?
And renewable portfolio standards might be, Nick, the transition. I don't know what the RPS standards are in terms of the percent at which the state has to start using renewables, but you know, these incremental asks would be being done by even young people.
Who else? I had another guest in the back. Come here. I'll come over here.
Thank you.
Actually, let's step into the light so that people can see you and you can identify yourself and tell us where you're from.
Hi, my name is Yelena, and I'm a graduate student here at GW. I'm originally from California. I think it was Dennis, did I say that right, who was talking about making investments in green mortgages.
That was Ted.
Sorry, Ted. So I was just wondering, you know, it's great to see this growing, you know, awareness and movement in the investment community. But, you know, how do you contextualize your green investments with your brown? Is that something that, you know, you're tracking? And how do you, you know, properly contextualize all the great investments you're doing in green projects and infrastructure?
We want to make ourselves as green a bank as we can, and that means we want to try to encourage green companies. We think it's good for our reputation. No bank in the world now is held in high esteem, and Nick's point about how reputational risk is important. We understand the importance of reputational risk, so we feel very strongly from the senior management, but also at a lower level of vice presidents, new analysts, they care about us, and they are helping us move the bank to be more thoughtful and use our brains to find new ways of financing that will encourage green development. Now, just because you want to do it, sometimes it's hard. Every once in a while we find technologies that are immensely promising, but we can't figure out how to commercialize them. You can't have a technology unless it can pay for itself. I'll give you an example of one where that's frustrating. We are working with a company that has the cheapest way of extracting CO2 out of the atmosphere. And they're going to build a new plant to do that. But the problem is that CO2 has limited commercial applications. You can put it in greenhouses, you can use it for enhanced oil recovery, and you can also use it in Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola. But we need to find
stuff.
better, we need to bottle that, but we need to find large-scale commercial uses for it that will help finance the extraction out of the air. And we haven't done that yet. So there always is the challenge, how do you come up with a technology and make sure that it is really commercial and can pay for itself?
Okay,
I
quickly,
really,
Nick,
just
'cause I
real
wanna get
quickly, not to put a shameless plug in for the electric utility industry, but in California, in your home state, there's been recognition that they need the utility to provide that platform for financing. Charging stations were a perfect example, where charging stations were only being put in rich neighborhoods. Now the utility's been required to put in charging stations to really focus on the development of electric vehicles so that California can meet the environmental objectives that it wants to meet. Those are clearly indications, and we work with multiple different types of small technology organizations that are trying to demonstrate the scope and scale of what they're able to provide. And we are a good platform for doing that. And I think that's a key point. If we have a progressive regulatory and governmental focus on this, then we can get it done. It just has to have the scope and scale to get it done.
We are getting a little short on time. There are a lot of people, so let's sort of turn this into a bit of a lightning round. And let me ask you, did you have a question here? And then Connor, did you have a question? Come on out to the aisle here. Let's get a couple. I'll move around, and if we can move quickly back and forth, let me get as much as I can.
So my question is for Nick. So my name is Raj Lakiani. I work for a energy technology company here in Washington, D.C., focused on distribution automation. And I always wondered this. I've been in utilities my entire career. Do you ever see utilities ever getting behind distributed generation in the sense of offering solar for the customers? I know that currently
Absolutely.
if you did that, that would cannibalize your sales and the infrastructure you guys have built. But when I think about other technology companies, like for example, Apple Computers,
Lightning round.
they came out with the iPod that saved the company, and then ultimately the iPhone, which cannibalized the iPod, but it led to all these other opportunities and applications, and now they're hitting almost $1 trillion market cap.
Okay. I don't want to cut you off, but
So
I'm gonna
real
stick to the lightning
quickly,
round. Go ahead.
everyone assumes that we're afraid of what's going on with distributed generation. Actually, the largest deployment of distributed generation is done by the utilities. And we want to make sure that we stay really relevant to our customers, so we have no choice but to focus on those energy efficiency types activities that may, on its face, look like less usage from an electricity perspective, but our business is about optimization, not about growing and building that next central station generation facility. The more that we're efficient from that perspective, the better off we'll be as a sustainable corporation going forward.
Okay, next lightning round. Where are you from?
I am from George Washington University here. I'm a senior. My name is Connor Muldowney. And my question is with regards to education. So we talked about how the coal mining industry is going to become somewhat obsolete despite of this current administration's pushing. And my question is, for the people who worked in those industries because they had a lack of education where they could not work in other jobs, in an emerging new job market, how do we make sure that they don't lag behind from those who have superior access to education?
Denise?
Well, there is a number of efforts to actually get them involved in solar installation. But I think manufacturing, as you were talking about, is an exceptional job opportunities. I know there's a lot, particularly with IBW and the steel workers who are and that are working with the parts, making parts for wind solar. So there's a number of industries that career pathways are sort of naturally aligned.
And that leadership needs to come from the state level, local level, federal level, business level. That needs to be a real partnership.
I had a conversation with Bill Clinton, and he really said it well. Whenever we start the process of making these types of transitions, we also need to be thinking about what the regular person out there that's trying to make it every day, how they're going to be able to make that transition. If you don't do that, you don't have a prayer.
Let me come right up the line here. Let's lay out a few things.
I think even to Ted's point earlier, a lot of these folks are already in their 50s and 60s, and making a transition is like not even in their future. So how do we make sure they have the pensions, and how do we have the health care to support them?
The part leading to this is that we have, in my opinion, as I stated clearly, a failure in our political conversation here. We also have a failure in education. Education has to be revalued so that we educate people better for the 21st and the 22nd centuries. And other countries are beginning to do that. The United States used to lead and had the best high school education system in the world. We now fail at that. But we can remedy that. That's not rocket science. We know how to do that.
Here's what I'm doing. I'm coming up to 2 or 3 of you. You can make your comment or question, and we'll play lightning round on the stage too, and then we got to move on. Connor.
I'm Connor Elliott-Nags, a senior from Elon University, and Ted, you just kind of touched on it. To what aspect are your social circles engaging the younger generations and creating educational opportunities to help facilitate that transition into this clean renewable energy section that we clearly need moving forward?
Don't answer. Hold on. We'll come back. Next.
Question for Ted. You mentioned about greenhouse mortgages.
You introduce yourself first.
Cassie.
From?
We're Jamaica.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier about greenhouse mortgages and being able to provide that incentive to people who want to develop greenhouses. How will you be able to ensure that people of lower income will be able to have access to these greenhouses? Because as we know right now, people of African American descent struggle to even be able to afford a mortgage anyway. So how will we not leave them out in this new environmental awareness movement as we go on?
Great question. We'll come to that.
I have a comment if they
Go
want
ahead.
to answer the question. Okay. Hi, my name is Isabella Zamit from the University of Arizona. I have a comment regarding environmental stewardship. I think that it is...
Lightning round. Just has to be a quick comment.
I live right across the street from Saguaro National Park, and I see every day how amazing people feel about seeing nature. I think that if people in the government were to practice environmental stewardship and reflect that to community-based levels especially, that would be one of the biggest pushes that the government could offer us.
Okay, I'm going to come back up to stage. You guys, we're going to come back if we can, but probably not, and you can catch people afterwards. Go ahead, Ted. Some of these to you.
Well, I got to
Denise?
try to remember the questions now.
All right, first one. How about your rich friends reaching out to young people?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that as I said earlier, the people who are in the elite community, I encourage everybody at Barclays, do this in one way or another. Get involved with the communities where you live, and try to move to a community next door and spend some time there. I try to do that. But the benefits to you are, one, it makes you smarter. You will be a better banker. You will be a better citizen if you do this. And you will learn a lot more about what's happening in this country, and therefore will be more informed about how you make political decisions. So,
and how about, to her question about making green mortgages, or any mortgages, available to lower income people and people of color?
Well, one of the things that we need to think about is we did see, I think with the very best intentions, the government through multiple administrations started policies to say we want to make mortgages more available to people who weren't as wealthy. And we managed to move home ownership in the United States from about 66% up to about 67.5%. It cost us about $1 trillion because of the mortgage crisis we went through. Wall Street clearly did some very bad things, but government hadn't really thought through the consequences. If you make mortgages more available to people who can't handle them, you're going to have a credit problem. So we have to be more honest with ourselves. If you want to increase home ownership, you've got to do a couple things, one of which you can take different plans, which is you will give a grant to people if they do certain things, that they will grant, and this has to be a political decision, in such that they get money that will now allow them to make a down payment on the house, and then they can borrow money because they've actually established through the grant a credit-worthy base so a bank can lend to them.
And some equity in the home.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
Denise?
I would also, though, recognize that 70% of people of color, low-income communities, are renters. 70% rent, and it'll be a long time before we get mortgages. So a lot of the work that we're doing is actually how do we bring solar into people that live in affordable housing projects or worker-owned housing. And some of it is making sure that ratepayer funds that you pay when you pay your utility bills that are going out for energy efficiency, which is the first fuel, essentially, how we make sure that those investments are available for low-income households. And we're also working, again, in Seattle with the state housing agency to bring in their dollars to bring solar and community grids in to allow people who rent to be a part of this clean energy future.
Guys, we're out of time here. I'm going to move on, but I want you to bring your ideas back to us, and we'll do that another time. I'm going to call on Bob Perciasepe for just a second before we go to our awards here. And while I'm doing this, maybe I can ask for a whiteboard. We're going real high tech with the whiteboard here for a few minutes. But Bob, if I could pull you over here. We talked a lot about where leadership is coming from. Stay where you are for now, because I'm going to come back to you. But we talked a lot about where leadership is coming from, different places. you were at the EPA. You were leadership, all right? What about, and how much do we need leadership at the national level?
Yeah, so I think what we heard here is that there is a lot going on that I'm going to hope is going to build the momentum to bring the federal government back into the argument. As I mentioned in my opening comments, we should be thinking about federal policies, and there's all kinds that could cover all these different issues. That's about the future, not about the past. And the future should be the winner, not the past. And so we should learn from the past. So there are many things the federal government, from research, DARPA was mentioned here, mortgage reform.
I mean, it's not like they've stopped all of this.
They haven't stopped all of it, but what's it focused on? What's it focused on is the key here. And so I think there's huge momentum from the corporate, from the community, from the investment community, from cities and states, but this will continue to float the boat a little bit, but eventually the boat's going to need a new direction from the federal government, and because this is a global problem. It's not Minneapolis's problem or Columbus, Ohio's problem. This is a global problem, and we can learn from all this, but the United States is the best country in the position to lead the world through this transition, and right now we have that gap.
Okay, here's what I want to do. Thanks, Bob. Here's what we're going to do now with this whiteboard. Are you Vanna White here? No, don't put it in the middle. Put it in the middle. Leave it right here. That's fine. Are you writing? All right. So we heard a lot of things here, and you've heard a lot of things here and over the last couple of days. Let me ask you, what does the public need to know? What do we need to make more clear? What stories could we tell? And we will then do some of these over the course of the next year. So here's your time. You can shout it out. I'm going to ask these four folks too, but should we start down in the audience? What does the public need to know? What comes to your mind? Yes?
I think more about the health impact.
More about the health impact. Health impact about what?
Things related to climate change, carbon emissions, pesticides.
Okay. Health impact on climate change, relating to climate change. Yes?
We need to...
Actually, let's do this. Sorry. Name and school?
Catherine Baker,
Columbia University.
Ryan McCrory, Middlebury College. I think we need to really emphasize affordability and...
Affordability of what?
Renewables and better efficiency technologies.
Affordability of renewables and better efficiency technologies. Are you going to be able to write fast? You're going to have to keep up with them. All right. Yes?
Katie from Mrs. Green's World. We need to improve the education system starting at a younger age to bring everything we learn.
All right. So more on the education system. We heard a lot about that. Who else? Yes?
I'm Emma Hagan from Eckerd College.
Eckerd College.
I've heard the word regenerative used instead of the word sustainability at multiple sessions here. What is the difference between those two concepts, and what does it mean to the people who are doing that work?
So maybe we look at what about the language that we use? Regenerative versus, and in fact, we had a conversation about this last night. Do we even talk about sustainability? All right, who's got another idea? Yes?
Michaela Hendricks, SUNY Plattsburgh. I think we need to focus more on engaging minority groups.
And more on engaging minority stories and listening to voices in minority communities, which is what...
that they're doing, because it's out there, it's just not seen.
Okay, in the back, yes?
Center for Technology. I think we should start talking more about China's national stores.
More about?
China's national stores policy and how it's going to affect our energy market, communities, and waste management.
China and energy, so talk globally, yes?
Enhancing America's...
Name, rank, school?
Julia, GW. Enhancing American sense of global citizenship.
Enhancing America's sense of global citizenship. What do you mean by that?
Well, the American lifestyle has a global impact, and if we don't care about communities across the world that we're impacting, then we're not going to...
So connecting America to the globe. Who else? Yes?
Micah, I'm from ESF, but something that another girl said, but more specifically, the indigenous-led movements and how, more their culture and their water's life concept.
Indigenous-led movements. Indigenous-led movements. Yes? Coastal communities and sinking cities. God, these are great story ideas. We got a lot of work to do here. Yes?
I'm a
Austin.
Yes?
Anna Saab, West Virginia University. I want to know more about the environmental and economic benefits to Appalachian communities.
To Appalachian communities, yes.
Isaiah, Penn State, recognizing, I'd say, like positive industrial efforts.
Recognizing positive industrial efforts. What do you mean by that?
I mean, recognizing companies that are
Like what Nick is doing.
coming to conferences like this.
Okay, okay, in the back.
Washington. I think, again, going off of, engaging minority stories and minority movements in the environmental sphere, I think we also need to talk about how people of color are disproportionately affected by climate change and how it's not just a responsibility for the planet, it's a responsibility for all of us that have the power to help and bring up.
Giant theme here, giant theme. More voices as part of this conversation. More voices. Yes?
Consumer impact.
Sorry, name, school?
Vanessa Moss, 20. We need to understand how even just the household purchases that we make affect the world around us.
Consumerism, the impact of consumers on the world around us, and energy and climate. Yes?
Janet Rogers, SUNY ESF. I would like more stories about artificial scarcity and industrial waste.
Artificial scarcity and industrial waste. Okay?
Paul Otteson, ESF, that if we allow mass extinction, we are creating hell on earth.
Mass extinction. Okay? Yes?
Austin Keating, Northwestern, energy storage, update.
Energy storage. Huge, huge issue, energy storage. You want to take solar? How do you store that power so when the sun isn't shining, you can still use it? We call that batteries and other things. Lots of other, in the back.
Jane Roshan, CW, we really need to trust and partner with the powerful
With local communities. More stories on local communities. Yes?
Jamie Hestican, University of Arkansas. I was thinking you could have something about, what he talked about, leadership from the Trump country finds people that you wouldn't expect to be leading on climate change, doing things and saying, hey, it's not just if you're a Democrat, you do this, if you're a person, you do this.
Okay, one or two more, and then we're going to come up on stage. Yes?
I think all these, Sierra from the University of Minnesota. I think all these ideas are fantastic, but we need to be educated on ways to take action on them.
Ways to take action. Okay, so stories on translating ideas and initiative into action. I love that. Mrs. Green.
We need to tell more stories about the farmers.
More stories about farmers.
Things they're doing that I learned so much about.
Okay, okay, and how they use energy. I said a couple more, but my goodness, go ahead.
We need more stories.
Name, school?
Elaine Johnson from Yale NUS College.
Yale NUS, by the way, is Yale National University of Singapore. Elaine gets the award for coming farthest.
Farthest away, yeah.
Bravo.
We need more stories of social movements making beautiful trouble that are going to lead to positive change, because we can march and march and march around the world in solidarity, but things are getting worse.
So, social movements making beautiful trouble to prompt social change. Okay? Yes?
Cute.
Tara Scully's from George Washington University. I think a good topic would be stop passing the buck to the younger generation.
Stop passing. Okay, all right. I love that. All right, one more. You got it.
Isabella Zamit from the University of Arizona. I would love to hear more about understanding your local watershed, water harvesting, and how to mitigate against drought.
Local watershed and how to mitigate against droughts. Denise, what's your story? What should we do?
Well, my story's in the book out in the hallway.
Well, if you want all these people from all across the country to echo that story, what?
It's energy democracy. I would, and I heard it in a lot of different voices here, and an amazing crew. The economy, it's not the technology. If we don't change this notion of how we're mass producing, mass consuming, mass accumulation of wealth.
So consumerism.
Then we're not being good stewards of the environment. I heard.
So how we consume and stewards the environment. Nick, what's the story you want us to tell?
I think the electric utility is the original social network, and ought to be used to really make advances from a climate change perspective, but also from an economic.
So give us a story suggestion. This is your big opportunity here. What should we do?
I think smart cities. If smart cities are
Smart
around
cities.
the country, is given a perfect example.
Smart cities. All right. Great. Susan.
Well, we obviously live in an area where we think there are no consequences to anything we do, so I'd actually like to know a lot more about what kind of crazy adaptation plans are out there. I hear about building breakwaters from Maine all the way to Florida. This doesn't sound like it scores very high on a cost-benefit analysis. So I'd like that. The other thing I would say is maybe a story, since at the end of the day, we've got to create the right political environment to get the right people in public office, to send the right signals to the marketplace. And I think the big story is that more people today are registered independents than they are either Democrats or Republicans. Where are the independents on this issue?
Ted.
Listening to this audience, there was an underlying theme which I'd like to re-articulate in my own words. Stories about how an individual or a few individuals have actually gotten and had major accomplishments that then can provide the incentives and leadership for others who will say, gee, I can do that too. So we need to have a sense of empowerment. Stories that empower people to say, we can make a difference because that's true.
Well, I want to, I want to thank our amazing panelists for doing this. And when you're finished writing, here's what we're going to do with this board. We're going to take pictures of this board. We're going to write these stories down. There are 15 Planet Forward correspondents, and every single one of you can help do this. Every single one of you can take this mission back to your campuses and list others to do this. You're taking classes in these areas. You're doing internship in these areas. You're volunteering in these areas. You're organizing in these areas. Find your voice, right? You've got these devices. You've got these talents. You've got these incredible skills. I want to show you something. And you can pull this board off here so we can make room for Sven and the rest now, because we're going to move forward. We got a note earlier today from a professor. Dear Planet Forward, he wrote, one of my students said she's learned more in a single day at Planet Forward Summit than in 5 days at a rangeland ecology conference. Kudos for a great summit. Thanks for all your work. Thank you to you. But he said, I want to share some posters that she has done. This is one you'd appreciate, Ted, from Yellowstone National Park.
Yes.
All right? The posters are part of a larger series that she designed and produced to communicate an alternate, darker reality for our national park. She's currently illustrating a field guide that will be published later this year. Kate Evanson, are you in the room? Would you stand up, Kate? All right. You tell stories and you connect with people and you communicate in lots of ways, as we saw with Anand and as we've heard from these folks. So that's what this is all about. Would you join me in thanking the panel? I hope you guys can stay for a few minutes and see our awards. If you can't, we understand. And we're going to move on. Thank you all very much.